Hey guys, tonight we take a walk across time, back to a land that few had seen before the ships came. Imagine the air is thick with the smell of dust and salt, the wind playing with the grasses, and the distant cry of birds as the sun sets behind distant hills. You stand on the southern tip of Africa, where the land drops into the great expanse of the ocean. The story we're about to dive into isn't one of bustling cities or grand kingdoms. It's the story of survival, of life lived in harmony with nature's slow, rhythmic pulse. The people of this land, the first to walk its paths, carved out an existence through an understanding of the land that runs deeper than most today could imagine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and the local time where you're watching. Let's see where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before the sailors, before the traders, and even before the first maps were drawn, the southernmost tip of Africa was a world in itself. The land was harsh and unforgiving, yet it was home to those who had learned to live in tune with its rhythm. Picture it, the wide stretches of golden plains, the deep, cool valleys, and the dense forests brimming with life. The coast, kissed by the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, was full of mystery. Few travelers had ventured this far, and those who did often never returned. It wasn't just the remoteness, it was the sheer force of nature here that made life so challenging. In this part of Africa, the San and Khoisan people were the first true inhabitants. They didn't just survive, they thrived in one of the world's most difficult environments. These peoples, often referred to as the Bushmen of southern Africa, were masters of their world, finding food in places where others saw nothing but barren land. Their story is one of survival, artistry, and a deep connection to the land, something that's difficult to understand from our modern, fast-paced perspective. They lived off the land, moving with it, never staying in one place too long, and yet, over thousands of years, they carved a life for themselves in these harsh conditions. It's easy to think of this time as primitive, but the truth is, it was incredibly sophisticated. There were no ships bringing goods from faraway lands, no horses or cattle to make life easier. But there was something deeper here, an understanding of how to read the landscape, how to hunt, how to gather, and how to exist in a world that demanded respect for its power. The people of this land didn't just survive, they lived in a way that was in complete harmony with their environment. You step forward, your feet pressing softly into the earth beneath you. It's quiet here, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any noise. And it's not just the land that's ancient, it's the people who've wandered here for millennia. Long before ships from faraway lands would ever drop anchor along the southern coast, these early people moved across this landscape, their paths as elusive as the wind. They didn't have maps or compasses. Their navigation was guided by the stars, the rhythm of the seasons, and an intimate understanding of every rock, tree, and river they passed. Historians still argue whether the first people came from the north or the east, whether they followed the rivers or moved with the migration of animals. What we do know is that they arrived long before the first stone walls were built or the first fields tilled. They arrived as part of a natural wave, a flow of human curiosity and survival. They were not invaders, but wanderers, with the continent before them still in its purest form. They settled, they hunted, they thrived, but always in motion, always part of something bigger than themselves, the land, the seasons, the animals that roamed beside them. The San and Khoisan, whose names are often used interchangeably but are, in fact, different groups, had already mastered the art of survival by the time anyone thought to leave written records of their existence. Their knowledge was passed down orally, stories told around campfires, each telling a piece of history, a piece of their survival. The land that was home to them was as much a spiritual landscape as it was physical. Every hill and valley had a story. Every animal had its role in the greater dance of life. It wasn't about conquering the land, it was about learning to live with it, to listen to it, to be part of it. These early people were not without their challenges. They didn't have the luxury of comfort, the convenience of technology, or the support of large, organized societies. They had only each other, the land, and their own wits to guide them. But with those tools they thrived. The Khoisan people, in particular, are credited with developing some of the world's oldest and most sophisticated tools. Their bows and arrows were marvels of design, suited for hunting in the harshest of environments. Their understanding of the plants and animals around them was unparalleled. But what stands out the most in their way of life was their intimate relationship with the land. They didn't just live on it, they were it. And it's here, in this untamed space, where the story begins to change. But not yet. The world outside this quiet, solitary landscape is still far away. So far, in fact, that no one could have predicted how quickly that isolation would vanish. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the terrain, and you feel the earth shift beneath your feet. The San and Khoisan people didn't just live in harmony with their surroundings. They knew it intimately. Every tree, every rock, every patch of earth was a part of their story. The San, often seen as the world's oldest continuous culture, were particularly in tune with the rhythms of the natural world. They didn't just survive, they listened to it. It was this deep connection to the earth that made them so adaptable and resilient. And in a land as unpredictable and wild as southern Africa, adaptability was everything. Historians still argue about the precise nature of the Khoisan people's relationship with their environment. Was it a sacred bond, or was it simply a matter of survival? Some scholars believe the Khoisan saw themselves as caretakers of the land, responsible for maintaining its delicate balance. Others suggest that it was more practical, an understanding of how to coexist with nature in order to thrive. Whichever way you look at it, one thing is certain: the Khoisan and San people were experts in surviving in a world that could be both beautiful and brutal. Their hunting techniques, for example, were nothing short of genius. The San were known for their incredibly accurate tracking skills, able to follow an animal's trail across vast stretches of wilderness. They would track their prey for days, using every clue left behind to slowly and steadily close the distance. The process was meticulous and required an extraordinary knowledge of the environment. They could read the signs of the land, from the broken twig to the droppings of an animal, with an accuracy that's hard to fathom today. And it wasn't just about the hunt itself. The San had an almost spiritual approach to hunting. It was a ritual, a dance with nature that went beyond the mere act of survival. They didn't just kill for food, they killed with respect for the creature and the land it came from. Hunting was a deeply spiritual practice, often involving elaborate rituals to honor the animal and the earth. The San believed that animals possessed spirits, and that hunting them required balance and respect. They understood that without the animals, they wouldn't survive, but they also knew that the animals depended on them for survival. It was a delicate symbiosis, a relationship built on mutual respect, where both the hunter and the hunted played their parts. The Khoisan also had a unique relationship with the plant life around them. In a place where water was scarce and food was hard to come by, they knew which plants could be eaten, which could heal, and which were dangerous. Some of their remedies were so effective that they're still used in modern herbal medicine today. They knew how to use every part of the plant, roots, leaves, bark, and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the healing properties of local flora. In fact, some of the first recorded uses of medicinal plants by Western medicine came from observations of Khoisan practices. They were, in a sense, the original pharmacists, living off the land's bounty long before anyone thought to catalog it. And yet, despite their mastery of the land, the Khoisan people never sought to dominate it. Their existence was built on a deep respect for the world around them. They were travelers, wanderers, never staying in one place for too long, moving with the seasons, and following the paths of the animals they hunted. Their nomadic lifestyle was one of freedom, a way to avoid the dangers of overhunting and to maintain the delicate balance with the land. In many ways, they were the ultimate survivalists, not because they had the strongest weapons or the best technology, but because they understood the land better than anyone else ever could. As the sun climbs higher, you feel the warmth of the day settling in, and you start to understand how vital cattle would soon become to the people of this land. But before we dive into the livestock that would alter the southern tip of Africa forever, let's pause for a moment to appreciate just how monumental the role of cattle would be. They weren't just animals, they were the very foundation of life itself. In a world where survival was fragile, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. Cattle represented wealth, power, and social status. Historians still argue whether cattle were the first true domesticated animal in southern Africa or if they arrived later, brought by migrating groups who understood their value. However, there is no debate about the fact that cattle revolutionized life on the southern tip. These sturdy, majestic creatures became symbols of prosperity, and the Khoisan quickly learned to incorporate them into their way of life. The cattle weren't just for milk and meat, they were central to the economy, social relations, and even spiritual practices of the people. The Khoisan people's relationship with their cattle was not just utilitarian. It was deeply embedded in their culture and spirituality. Cattle were considered a gift from the gods, and they played a major role in rituals and ceremonies. They were central to important events in life, from birth to death. The more cattle you had, the more respect you commanded. They were the currency of the time, more valuable than gold or silver. Families with large herds enjoyed higher social standing, while those with fewer cattle were seen as less prosperous, though still respected for their knowledge and survival skills. Cattle were also crucial in the social structure of the Khoisan and later other groups that would come to settle in the region. Their role as a measure of wealth was so profound that when people married, cattle often served as the bride price, an exchange that solidified relationships between families and tribes. But this wasn't just about wealth, it was also about maintaining balance and harmony within the community. A gift of cattle was a way of showing respect, building alliances, and ensuring a peaceful, prosperous future for everyone involved. The importance of cattle was so deeply ingrained in the Khoisan culture that they became part of the landscape itself. They weren't just animals, they were the animals that defined the very fabric of life. Each herd was like a living, breathing testament to the endurance and strength of the people. Their hooves dug deep into the earth, creating paths that would be used for generations. These paths weren't just trails, they were the lifeblood of the Khoisan, guiding them from water sources to grazing lands, from sacred grounds to homes. The relationship between the people and their cattle was so intertwined that it became impossible to imagine life without them. But life wasn't just about cattle. In the vast open spaces, with the earth stretching endlessly before you, there were other creatures that lived in harmony with the Khoisan. The landscape teemed with life, baboons, antelope, and the elusive lion roamed freely. Yet, it was the cattle that were at the heart of this world. With every step they took across the land, the Khoisan wrote their story in the soil. The animals they raised, the land they lived on, and the skies above them were all part of the same grand narrative, a dance of survival, wealth, and spiritual connection. And so, cattle became more than just livestock, they were the very soul of the Khoisan way of life. As the seasons turned and the years passed, they grew in importance, serving as the pillars upon which the social, economic, and spiritual life of the southern tip was built. As the horizon begins to soften under the light of the setting sun, we find ourselves at the heart of the story of the San people. While the Khoisan were busy cultivating cattle into the center of their world, the San, often referred to as Bushmen, were masters of a different way of life. They didn't rely on cattle or large herds to define their wealth. Instead, they found their riches in the land itself, in the animals they tracked and the plants they foraged. For the San, survival was a delicate art, refined over thousands of years. It was about knowing when to move, when to hunt, and when to sit still and listen to the rhythm of the earth. Historians still argue over how the San fit into the larger picture of the Khoisan peoples. Were they a distinct group, or were they simply a division of the larger Khoisan family? Some believe the San were the original inhabitants, the ones who had lived in the region long before cattle became central to life. Others suggest that over time, the San adapted to a world in which cattle became more and more important, their way of life shifting as new tribes and cultures entered the region. Regardless of their origins, one thing is certain: the San were unparalleled in their ability to read the land and live in a constant dance with nature. The San's hunting techniques were legendary, and they became known for their skill at tracking, a practice passed down through generations. They didn't rely on speed or strength to catch their prey. Instead, they relied on patience and a deep understanding of the environment. Imagine walking silently through the thick brush, your eyes scanning the ground for the slightest clue of what's ahead: a broken twig, a fresh footprint, the telltale droppings of a buck. This was the San way. Their hunting parties would track animals for days, patiently following the animals' every movement until they were close enough to make the kill. But it wasn't just the animals they were watching, it was the land itself. They knew every contour, every stone, every hidden spring. To the San, every step they took was part of an ongoing dialogue with the earth. But their hunting wasn't just about food, it was also a spiritual practice. The San believed that animals had souls and that to hunt them, they needed to be approached with respect. Their hunting rituals were filled with ceremony, and before setting out on a hunt, the San would often engage in trance dances to connect with the spirits of the animals they sought. These dances weren't just for entertainment. They were a way of aligning themselves with the natural world, seeking permission from the spirits of the animals to take their lives. The act of hunting was sacred, and it wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a matter of balance. The San's connection to the land didn't end with hunting. They were also skilled gatherers, knowing exactly when and where to find edible plants, fruits, and tubers. Their knowledge of the environment was so deep that they could find food in the most unlikely places. The San understood the seasons better than anyone. They knew when to expect certain plants to bloom, when the rains would come, and when the herds would migrate. Their survival wasn't just about tracking animals. It was about living in harmony with everything around them. They never took more than they needed and never stayed in one place for too long. The land was constantly changing, and so they followed its lead, moving from one spot to the next, always in tune with the rhythms of nature. Their lives were defined by mobility, a constant journey that tied them to the land and the seasons. They lived in small, tight-knit groups, always on the move, never settling for too long in one place. The San were nomads, not because they had to be, but because it was the only way to maintain the delicate balance with nature that they had honed over millennia. They didn't build permanent homes. Instead, they constructed temporary shelters made of branches and leaves, designed to be easily dismantled and moved when the time came. For the San, home wasn't a place, it was a way of life, a fluid existence tied to the land that supported them. And in the quiet of the evening, when the campfire crackled and the stars filled the sky, the San told stories. They shared tales of the animals they had hunted, of spirits that watched over them, and of the land that had given them life. These stories were more than just entertainment. They were a way of passing down knowledge, of teaching the younger generations how to survive in a world that was both beautiful and dangerous. For the San, survival wasn't just about knowing how to track an animal or find water. It was about understanding the very essence of life, of living in tune with the land, and of passing that wisdom on to those who would follow. The campfire's glow flickers, and the night air cools as we turn our focus to something deceptively simple: beads. Yes, beads. At first glance, they might seem like trivial adornments, nothing more than colorful trinkets strung together. But to the San and Khoisan, they were far more than decorative accessories. These small, often intricately crafted objects held a profound spiritual and cultural significance. Beads, made from shells, bone, and stone, were not merely for decoration, they were markers of identity, currency, and even a connection to the divine. Historians still argue over the origins of bead making in southern Africa. Some suggest that the practice began with the San, who used natural materials like shells and animal bones to create their beads. Others point to the Khoisan, who expanded on these techniques and created more elaborate designs. Regardless of who started the tradition, it's clear that bead making became a cornerstone of Khoisan culture. These beads were more than just personal adornments. They carried stories, represented social status, and were integral to spiritual rituals. The beads were used in a variety of ways, often as part of a ritual or ceremony. They were exchanged in trade, given as gifts, and used as part of initiation rites. But perhaps most interestingly, beads were used as a form of communication. Without written language, the Khoisan and San relied heavily on symbolism to convey messages. A specific pattern of beads could signify a person's status within the tribe, their achievements, or even their relationship to the spiritual world. The colors and shapes were imbued with meaning, certain colors represented specific spiritual beliefs, while the number of beads in a necklace could indicate the wearer's social rank. But beads weren't just for decoration, they had practical uses as well. Shell beads, in particular, were used as a form of currency. They could be traded for goods, used as offerings, or given as part of a dowry. Cattle, the prized possession of the Khoisan, were often exchanged for beads in a show of wealth and respect. The beads became a valuable commodity, passed down through generations as symbols of wealth and status. Families would pass on their beads as inheritance, each bead carrying the weight of history and tradition. In many ways, they were like the cattle, symbols of prosperity, but also deeply embedded in the social fabric of the people. In the realm of spirituality, beads held even greater importance. For the Khoisan, beads were not just material objects, they were tools for connecting with the spirit world. Beads were often used in ceremonial dances and trance rituals, worn by shamans and spiritual leaders as they sought to commune with the ancestors or heal the sick. The rhythm of the beads as they clinked together in the dance was thought to summon spirits, to bring the living closer to the ancestors, and to invoke protection and guidance. The act of wearing beads was an expression of one's relationship to the divine, a reminder that the physical world and the spiritual world were always intertwined. Shells, the primary material for the earliest beads, had their own significance. The coastal regions of southern Africa were rich in marine life, and the shells found along the shores were highly prized. Some beads were made from shells harvested from the ocean, while others were crafted from the bones and teeth of animals. Each bead type had a specific meaning, and the crafting process itself was a spiritual act. The person creating the beads would often enter a meditative state, guided by the belief that the beads themselves contained a form of magic, a way to connect with the ancestors, with nature, and with the greater forces of the world. As we reflect on this tradition, we begin to understand that these beads were not simply adornments, they were a reflection of the Khoisan worldview. They were a tangible manifestation of their connection to the land, to the animals, to the spirits, and to each other. In every bead, there was a story of survival, spirituality, and identity that carried the people of this land through generations. As the fire flickers, casting dancing shadows across the rugged landscape, we shift our focus to one of the most essential, yet often overlooked, features of southern Africa, the great rivers. The mighty rivers of the region aren't just sources of water, they are the lifeblood of the land, crisscrossing it like veins, carrying with them not just water but stories, histories, and entire ways of life. These rivers were more than just resources for the people of the southern tip. They were living entities, connected to the myths, legends, and the very spiritual fabric of the land. Historians still argue about how deeply these rivers were integrated into the lives of the San and Khoisan peoples. Some suggest that the rivers were seen as sacred spaces, gateways between the living and the spirit world, while others believe they were primarily seen as practical routes for travel and trade. Regardless, one thing is certain: the rivers of southern Africa played a central role in shaping the culture and survival strategies of the people who lived there. The rivers were more than just sources of life-sustaining water. They were also vital transportation routes, connecting different tribes, allowing them to trade goods, share stories, and even engage in conflict. The San, with their knowledge of the land, often used the rivers to guide their journeys. They followed the winding paths of the rivers to find new hunting grounds, to discover fresh water, and to navigate their way through the dense wilderness. The rivers were their maps, their guides, and their lifelines. Without them, their survival would have been far more precarious. And it wasn't just the San who relied on the rivers. The Khoisan, with their cattle herds, also understood the importance of these watercourses. The rivers provided them with more than just water for their herds. They were places where cattle could graze and drink. The Khoisan knew the rhythms of the rivers intimately, understanding when the water levels would rise and fall, when certain areas would flood and when others would dry up. Their knowledge of the river systems was an essential part of their survival strategy. They built their lives around the ebb and flow of these mighty waters. But the rivers weren't just practical, they were deeply intertwined with the spirituality of the region. For the Khoisan and San, the rivers were living entities. They were often personified in myths, told stories of by the campfires as ancient spirits who watched over the people. The rivers weren't just places of survival. They were sacred places where people would go to connect with the divine. The San believed that the rivers were inhabited by powerful spirits who could both nourish and destroy. Some myths suggested that the rivers were portals to the spirit world, places where souls of the departed could cross over to the afterlife. The Khoisan, too, saw the rivers as magical forces, not just water channels but divine entities that could provide protection, healing, and wisdom to those who approached them with respect. The way the people of southern Africa viewed the rivers is reflected in the names they gave them. Many of the rivers have names that are linked to spiritual meanings, evoking reverence and awe. These names didn't just describe a geographical feature, they described an experience, a way of life. The rivers were alive in their minds, as alive as the creatures that roamed the land or the cattle they tended to. But the rivers weren't just about the spiritual world, they were essential for physical survival. The water they provided was crucial not only for drinking but also for agriculture and fishing. The region's rivers, though challenging to navigate at times due to their unpredictable floods and rapids, allowed the people of the land to thrive. Fishing was an essential part of the Khoisan diet. They didn't rely solely on game and plant life but also on the bounty provided by the rivers. The fish caught in the rivers were rich in nutrients, sustaining the people and providing valuable protein to their diet. In many ways, the rivers of southern Africa were the region's original highways. They connected distant groups and brought together tribes that might otherwise have never met. The flows of trade, ideas, and culture spread along these rivers, crossing paths in ways that may have shaped the earliest exchanges between different groups in the region. Even without formal trade routes, the rivers provided a natural conduit for the exchange of goods and stories, and they played a central role in the development of a regional culture that, though diverse, was connected through these liquid highways. As we stand here by the fire, the last embers glowing before the darkness completely overtakes the land, we are reminded of the timelessness of these rivers. They flow still, just as they did thousands of years ago, carrying the whispers of those who came before us, and perhaps, if you listen closely enough, the spirits of the land and the people who lived in harmony with it. The stillness of the night deepens as the shadows stretch and settle into the land. Here, we explore the intricate dance between the San, the Khoisan, and the very essence of the environment around them. Survival wasn't just about hunting game or gathering plants. It was about being able to move through the world in a way that was entirely symbiotic, where the people and the land weren't just coexisting but were part of one unspoken rhythm. Hunting and gathering were art forms here, seemingly simple acts that required an astonishing depth of skill, knowledge, and intuition. Historians still argue over the full scope of the San and Khoisan's hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Was it a static way of life, unchanged over the millennia, or did the people's methods evolve as the land itself shifted? Regardless of the answer, what is indisputable is that these peoples were masters of survival, and they achieved it through a refined system of tracking, gathering, and utilizing resources in ways that are, to this day, deeply respected. For them, nothing was wasted, not a single plant, not a single piece of bone. Every aspect of their world had a role to play in the larger ecosystem they nurtured. The San were particularly skilled in hunting, tracking their prey for days on end, their movements almost ghost-like. They weren't just chasing animals. They were weaving a delicate web of patience, precision, and deep understanding of the land. To follow an animal's trail through harsh terrain, in extreme heat, sometimes for days without sleep or food, takes more than just physical endurance. It requires an almost spiritual connection to the land, a way of seeing and sensing that goes beyond mere observation. The San's hunting techniques were based on the principle of conservation, never taking more than was necessary and always ensuring that their actions did not disrupt the natural balance. When the San went hunting, they weren't simply aiming to kill. They were engaging in a spiritual exchange with the animals. In fact, hunting was as much about maintaining harmony with the natural world as it was about feeding their families. The hunt was accompanied by rituals and ceremonies, where the hunters would engage in trance dances, seeking guidance and blessings from the spirits of the animals. The act of the hunt itself was a spiritual transaction, a way of communicating with the world around them. The animals were not seen as mere creatures to be hunted but as spiritual entities to be respected. The Khoisan, too, had their own methods of ensuring that the delicate balance of the ecosystem was maintained. Though they had the added advantage of cattle, they did not exploit them recklessly. Instead, their herds were carefully tended to, and the people moved with them, following the grazing paths and ensuring that the herds never overstretched the land's capacity to provide. The Khoisan had learned to read the land in a way that allowed them to use the resources without overusing them, to move with the seasons, to adapt to the changing patterns of the environment. It wasn't just about survival, though. This lifestyle, this art of living off the land, was steeped in rituals and ceremonies that held the community together. For the San and Khoisan, the world was a place of balance, where every part of nature had a role to play. The hunter needed the animal, but the animal also needed the hunter, to complete the cycle. The earth needed both to thrive. This symbiotic relationship is something that modern societies have lost, but it was a cornerstone of life at the southern tip of Africa, a connection between people and the environment that stretched across generations. The act of gathering was equally significant. The Khoisan were experts in foraging, using the land's bounty to sustain them. They knew which plants were edible, which were medicinal, and which could be used for tools. The knowledge passed down through the generations was a living encyclopedia, one that allowed them to thrive even in the harshest conditions. For the Khoisan, every plant had a purpose, every root and leaf a potential remedy or tool. The land provided for them in ways that would be unimaginable to many today. Their gathering wasn't haphazard. It was a learned practice, an art form in itself. Plants had seasons, just like animals. And just as the San knew when to hunt, the Khoisan knew when and where to gather. They understood the delicate balance between the plants and animals in their world, and they worked within that balance to ensure they were not taking more than the land could give. The beauty of it all lies in the simplicity. They didn't need stores of goods or factories or modern technology. They had each other, and they had the land. And that was enough. The San and Khoisan peoples lived with a respect for their environment that, in many ways, has been lost to time. They understood the true value of their world, not as something to be conquered, but as something to be respected, nurtured, and protected. And in this respect, they had mastered life in ways that few could even begin to understand. As the stars emerge overhead, their light shimmering through the cool night air, we turn to another chapter of life at the southern tip, a chapter filled with conflict, yet also one of survival and transformation. The San and Khoisan peoples had long lived in relative peace, moving across the land as they had for centuries. But as populations grew and new tribes entered the region, the first sparks of conflict began to smolder. The land, which had been shared by those who understood its rhythms, now began to divide. The Khoisan and San were not immune to the natural tensions that arise when different cultures meet. Historians still argue over the nature of these early conflicts. Were the Khoisan and San in direct competition for resources with other groups, or was it more a matter of cultural misunderstandings? Some suggest that early conflicts were rooted in the pressure of land and resource scarcity, especially as the Khoisan people's cattle herds grew and their reliance on grazing lands intensified. As other groups, including the Bantu-speaking peoples, began to migrate southward, tensions grew. These new arrivals, with their more settled lifestyles and larger farming communities, found themselves in competition with the Khoisan for land and resources. However, others argue that much of the conflict between these groups wasn't necessarily violent, but instead a clash of lifestyles and worldviews. The Khoisan's mobile, hunter-gatherer lifestyle was fundamentally different from the more agricultural lifestyle of the Bantu and other migrating groups. This divergence in ways of life likely caused tension, not just in terms of land, but in terms of how each group viewed their place in the world. For the Khoisan, the land was to be respected and used in balance with the natural world. For the new arrivals, land was something to be cultivated, controlled, and farmed. In the midst of these changing dynamics, it's important to remember that the Khoisan and San weren't simply victims of outside forces. They were resilient, fiercely protective of their way of life, and they had their own systems for dealing with conflict. Their social structures, built around clans and families, were designed to foster cooperation, but they also had mechanisms for resolving disputes. Feuds were often settled through ritual combat, where two individuals or families would face off in a controlled manner, allowing tensions to dissipate without escalating into full-scale war. These conflicts, while potentially intense, were bound by cultural rules that emphasized respect and restoration of harmony. The Khoisan were also masters of negotiation. As the pressures from outside groups mounted, they often turned to diplomacy, finding ways to broker peace or form alliances with new arrivals. They understood that survival wasn't just about strength or dominance. It was also about knowing when to stand firm and when to compromise. This skill in negotiation helped them maintain some level of autonomy in a rapidly changing world. The rise of cattle herding among the Khoisan also added a new layer of complexity to these conflicts. Cattle, as symbols of wealth and power, became valuable commodities that could be traded, stolen, or used as leverage in conflicts. This added an economic dimension to the tensions between the Khoisan and other groups. Cattle raids, though often framed as acts of aggression, were also a way to assert power and status, especially in the face of mounting external pressure. But in many cases, cattle were not just taken, they were used to negotiate peace or settle disputes. Yet, despite these tensions, the Khoisan and San never abandoned their way of life. Their resilience was rooted in their deep connection to the land, their ability to adapt, and their refusal to let outside pressures dictate their survival. Even as new groups encroached upon their territory, the Khoisan and San maintained their culture, their spirituality, and their way of living in balance with nature. In some ways, their ability to adapt to these external pressures made them stronger, more resourceful, and more united in their commitment to preserve what they had. These early conflicts, though often framed as battles for land, were really battles for the survival of a way of life that had thrived for thousands of years, long before the first explorers sailed to these shores. And though the tide of history would eventually sweep the Khoisan and San peoples into the shadows of colonialism and expansion, their legacy lives on in the land itself, in the rivers, the animals, and the stories they left behind. The moonlight now softens, casting a silver glow over the still landscape, and it's time to consider the subtle currents of movement that shaped the early exchanges between the San, the Khoisan, and the world beyond their borders. Before the first European ships anchored on the shores of southern Africa, long before the maps were redrawn and the borders were established, the people of the southern tip engaged in a quiet, yet profound, exchange of goods and ideas. It wasn't trade as we know it today. There were no bustling markets or merchant ships bringing spices and textiles. It was a slow, flowing network of connections, much like the rivers that wound through the land. Historians still debate the scope and nature of these early trade routes. Were the San and Khoisan isolated from the larger world, or did they have deep, intricate trade networks with peoples from the north, east, and beyond? Some suggest that the Khoisan, with their cattle, beads, and other valuable resources, acted as middlemen between the interior and the coast, facilitating trade between different groups long before the first Europeans arrived. Others argue that while there were exchanges, they were limited and largely based on local or tribal needs rather than large-scale, organized trade. But what's undeniable is that these early exchanges were crucial in shaping the lives of the people living at the bottom of Africa. The Khoisan, with their knowledge of the land and their cattle, traded not just for goods but for cultural knowledge. Their beads, shell currency, and the intricate crafts they made were valued far beyond their own communities. The San, too, with their hunting prowess and intimate knowledge of the land, played a role in this network, offering their skills in exchange for the goods they couldn't produce themselves. These trades were subtle, personal, and embedded in the fabric of their daily lives, far removed from the commercialized trade that would come with European influence. One of the most striking aspects of this early exchange was the flow of ideas. The Khoisan and San weren't just trading material goods, they were exchanging knowledge. As other groups, particularly the Bantu-speaking peoples, began to migrate southward, they brought with them their farming techniques, iron tools, and new ways of seeing the world. The Khoisan and San didn't just resist these ideas, they absorbed them, adapted them, and made them their own. The introduction of farming tools, for example, influenced how the Khoisan cared for their cattle. Iron tools helped them improve their cattle herding and processing techniques, while the introduction of agriculture created new ways to gather food and trade. But this wasn't a one-way exchange. The Khoisan and San, with their deep connection to the land and their knowledge of the environment, also had much to offer in return. Their understanding of the natural world, their methods of hunting, and their spiritual connection to the earth became part of the broader cultural exchange. The San's knowledge of plant life, for instance, proved invaluable to other groups, who learned to utilize the medicinal plants that the San had long relied on. These slow, subtle exchanges helped shape the way people in southern Africa interacted with each other and with the world around them. Though these early trade routes were not as formalized as the ones that would emerge with the arrival of Europeans, they played a crucial role in shaping the dynamics of the region. They weren't just about material gain, they were about survival, adaptation, and mutual respect between groups who had learned to live in harmony with the land. The Khoisan and San didn't just live on the edge of the known world. They were active participants in a complex web of human interaction that spanned thousands of miles. As the centuries passed and the first European sailors began to arrive, these early exchanges would evolve into something much more complex, as the region began to feel the weight of global trade. But before the ships and the colonial powers, the southern tip of Africa was already a place where people from different cultures met, shared, and learned from one another, shaping the land and the people in ways that are still felt today. The stars above seem to hold the secrets of ancient stories, and as we sit beneath them, we turn our attention to the unsung heroes of this land, the women. Often relegated to the background of historical narratives, the women of the Khoisan and San peoples were, in fact, the backbone of their communities. They were not just passive observers of life's rhythms, they were active participants, shaping the very core of the social and cultural structures that sustained their people. Historians still argue about the exact role of women in the societies of the Khoisan and San. While much of the focus has traditionally been on the men, hunters and warriors, the women were the ones who ensured the continuity of life. They were the gatherers, the caretakers of children, and the custodians of knowledge. It was the women who tended to the plants, gathered the roots and fruits, and knew which herbs could heal and which were poisonous. Their knowledge of the natural world was as vast and intricate as that of the hunters. But beyond survival, they were the keepers of stories, the carriers of culture, and the maintainers of social order. The Khoisan and San societies were deeply egalitarian, especially when compared to many other ancient cultures. Though men did the hunting, women were responsible for much of the food gathering, making sure that no one in their community went hungry. The gathering of plants, tubers, and fruits was no small task. It was labor-intensive work that required great knowledge and skill. Women knew when to harvest, which plants to avoid, and how to use every part of a plant for food, medicine, or tools. Their role in the food chain was as essential as the men's role in hunting. But the women's contribution didn't stop there. They were also the social glue that held their communities together. They organized daily life, ensuring that the needs of children, the elderly, and the sick were met. Women would often form the core of the social gatherings, telling stories, passing down traditions, and organizing important ceremonies. Through them, the oral history of the San and Khoisan peoples was kept alive, generation after generation. The elders, often women, would share tales of ancestors, of the land, and of the animals that roamed the earth. These stories were not only for entertainment, they were lessons, ways of teaching the younger generation how to survive and live in harmony with the world around them. In addition to their social roles, Khoisan and San women also played a critical part in the spiritual life of their communities. Many of the rituals, especially those related to healing and rites of passage, were led by women. Shamans, often women, would engage in trance dances, using their spiritual connection to the earth to heal the sick, communicate with ancestors, and guide the community. These women were not just healers, they were spiritual leaders, carrying with them the wisdom of the land and the spiritual realm. The women's role in Khoisan and San society was also reflected in the way they contributed to the economy. While the men may have owned the cattle, it was the women who made sure the herds were cared for, ensuring that the animals were properly tended, fed, and protected. They also played a crucial role in the preparation of hides, using their skills to create clothing, blankets, and other necessary items. These tasks were essential to the survival of their communities, as they provided warmth and protection from the harsh environment. Yet, despite their pivotal role, women in these societies were not seen as subservient or inferior. Instead, they were highly respected for their knowledge and wisdom. The Khoisan and San cultures were matrilineal in many respects, with lineage and inheritance passed down through the mother. A woman's wealth was often measured by the size of her herds and the number of children she had, but her true value lay in her knowledge of the land, her ability to nurture and sustain life, and her strength in maintaining the social and spiritual health of the community. In many ways, the women of the Khoisan and San were the true stewards of their cultures, ensuring that the traditions and values that had been passed down through the ages were preserved for the generations to come. They were the heart of the community, shaping its past, present, and future. As we sit in the cool of the evening, we realize that the story of the Khoisan and San is incomplete without recognizing the critical role played by the women. They were not just passive participants in the cycles of life. They were the ones who carried the knowledge, the traditions, and the wisdom that allowed their people to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Their contributions, often overlooked in traditional histories, were as vital as the land itself. The winds shift, carrying the sound of distant birds calling out in the twilight. Now, we find ourselves exploring the wild kingdom that surrounded the Khoisan and San people, the animals they lived with, relied on, and revered. These animals weren't just creatures that wandered through their world. They were companions, challenges, and symbols of the very forces of nature they respected and feared. The animals of the southern tip weren't just part of the environment. They were intertwined with the spiritual, social, and economic fabric of the people who called this land home. Historians still debate the depth of the Khoisan's relationship with the animals they encountered. Were they merely hunters, or did they have a deeper, more spiritual connection with these creatures? Many scholars agree that the San and Khoisan viewed animals as beings with souls, and their role in the world was just as important as that of the people. The relationship between the two was not based on domination but on balance. Each part of the ecosystem had a role to play, and it was crucial to respect that balance in order to survive. The San's knowledge of the animals they hunted was extraordinary. They could track animals across miles of rugged terrain, deciphering the smallest clues left behind, a broken branch, a footprint, or the direction of the wind. But their connection to animals went beyond just survival. They had an almost mystical relationship with them. The hunt itself was not just a means of providing food, it was a spiritual act. Before embarking on a hunt, the San would often perform trance dances, seeking permission from the spirit of the animals they planned to kill. The animal was viewed not as a mere commodity, but as a sacred being whose life was to be taken with respect and gratitude. Certain animals were considered more sacred than others. The lion, for example, held a special place in the mythology of the Khoisan and San peoples. It was seen as a symbol of strength, courage, and power. The lion's majestic form and fearsome reputation made it a creature of awe, and its role in the spiritual world was one of leadership and protection. The Khoisan and San believed that the lion had the power to guide and protect them, and it was often seen as a protector spirit, a guardian of the land. Other animals, like the antelope, were seen as symbols of grace and beauty. Their speed, agility, and ability to survive in the harsh conditions of the southern tip made them a symbol of resilience. The San and Khoisan admired the antelope for its ability to navigate the landscape with ease, and many of their hunting rituals were focused on honoring the antelope and its spirit. In fact, the skill of tracking and hunting antelope was considered one of the highest honors in San culture. The hunter who could track and capture an antelope was regarded with great respect, not just for his physical prowess, but for his spiritual connection to the animal. The Khoisan also lived in close relationship with the smaller creatures of the land, baboons, birds, and even insects. Each of these creatures had its place in the spiritual realm. The baboon, for example, was often seen as a trickster figure in Khoisan mythology, embodying both wisdom and mischief. Baboons were respected for their intelligence, their ability to adapt to the changing environment, and their uncanny ability to navigate the most difficult of terrains. They were also seen as symbols of family and social structure, as their lives were built around tight-knit family groups, much like the human communities of the Khoisan. Birds, too, played an important role in the spiritual life of the Khoisan. The eagle, with its soaring flight and keen eyesight, was seen as a messenger between the heavens and the earth. The Khoisan believed that birds had the power to carry messages from the spirits, and they often looked to the flight patterns of birds for guidance. The movement of birds across the sky was interpreted as a sign of the spiritual forces at work in the world, guiding the people toward the right path. But it wasn't just the large and powerful animals that were important. The smaller creatures, the insects, the reptiles, the birds, held deep significance in the Khoisan worldview. Every creature, no matter how small, had its role to play in the grand scheme of life. The Khoisan and San people understood that their survival was interdependent with that of the animals around them. They respected the creatures they lived with, not as resources to be exploited, but as partners in the delicate balance of life. This respect for the natural world extended to the land itself. The Khoisan and San peoples didn't see the earth as something to be owned or conquered. They saw it as a living entity, one that had to be cared for, nurtured, and respected. Their entire way of life was built around this understanding. They moved with the land, following the patterns of the animals, the rivers, and the seasons. Their existence was a dance with nature, where every step was taken in harmony with the world around them. As we sit in the quiet of the night, surrounded by the sounds of nature, it becomes clear that the relationship between the Khoisan, the San, and the animals was far more than one of survival. It was a sacred bond, one that transcended the physical world and entered into the spiritual realm. The animals were not just part of the environment, they were partners in life, teachers, and guides. And as we look to the future, it's a reminder that the balance between humans and the natural world is something that must always be maintained. The night deepens, and the stars above seem to sparkle with the ancient wisdom of the land. Now, we turn our attention to the myths and stories that shaped the worldviews of the Khoisan and San peoples. For them, the land was more than just a place to live, it was a canvas upon which stories were written, a stage for the spirits that roamed both the earth and the sky. Myths weren't just entertainment, they were the keys to understanding life, death, and everything in between. They explained how the world worked, how the animals and humans coexisted, and how the spirits of the past still walked alongside the living. Historians still argue about the role of myth in these early cultures. Some scholars believe that myth was a way for the Khoisan and San to make sense of the chaos and unpredictability of their environment, while others see myth as a deeper, more spiritual connection to the world around them. Regardless of the interpretation, one thing is certain: myth played a central role in the lives of the people of the southern tip of Africa. These stories were not merely tales, they were sacred truths, carried from one generation to the next, preserving the knowledge and beliefs of the ancestors. The stories of the Khoisan and San are filled with animals, spirits, and gods, figures that were believed to shape the world and guide the people. Some of these myths explain the origins of the land, the animals, and even the stars themselves. For example, the Khoisan believed that the moon was created by a powerful spirit who reached into the sky and tore it free from the earth. The moon wasn't just a celestial body, it was a reminder of the spiritual forces that shaped the world and the people's place within it. And the stars? They were the eyes of the ancestors, watching over the living, guiding them through the darkness of the night. One of the most prominent figures in Khoisan mythology was the trickster god, sometimes called the Rainmaker, or Cunning One. This figure was both a creator and a destroyer, a being who could shape the world with a flick of his fingers but also cause chaos and confusion. He was a figure of immense power, but his power wasn't always benevolent. In many stories, the trickster god would play tricks on both humans and animals, leading them astray or causing them to make mistakes. These stories weren't just about entertainment, they were moral lessons, teaching the people about the complexities of life, the balance between good and evil, and the consequences of one's actions. But the trickster wasn't the only figure in the Khoisan and San mythology. There were also stories of benevolent gods, spirits who protected the people and the animals, who helped heal the sick, and who guided the hunters in their pursuits. These gods were often associated with the natural world, the sun, the moon, the earth, and the water. They were not distant, abstract beings. They were part of the world itself, woven into the fabric of life. The myths also served as a way to explain the cycles of life. The Khoisan and San saw death not as an end, but as a transition, a return to the spirit world. When someone died, they believed their soul journeyed to the land of the ancestors, where they would be welcomed with open arms and given a place in the great cycle of life. The spirits of the ancestors were believed to continue watching over the living, offering guidance and protection. In times of crisis, it was the spirits who could be called upon for help, and the living would turn to rituals and prayers to commune with them. Rituals and ceremonies played an integral role in maintaining the connection between the living and the spiritual world. The Khoisan and San performed ceremonies to mark important milestones in life: births, deaths, marriages, and hunts. These ceremonies were not only social events but also spiritual ones, aimed at ensuring harmony between the physical and spiritual realms. During these ceremonies, the people would engage in dances, sing songs, and offer sacrifices to the gods and spirits. The use of trance dances, in particular, was a way of entering into the spiritual world, allowing the dancers to communicate with the ancestors and the spirits of the land. These myths, stories, and rituals helped the Khoisan and San navigate the complexities of their world. They provided a framework for understanding the mysteries of life, death, and the universe. But they also helped to reinforce social bonds. The sharing of stories around the campfire wasn't just about passing the time. It was about maintaining a connection with the past and with each other. These stories were a way of binding the community together, reminding them of their shared history, their shared values, and their shared responsibilities. As the fire burns low and the night stretches on, we see that these myths were more than just tales. They were the lifeblood of the Khoisan and San peoples. They were a way of preserving culture, of teaching the young, and of keeping the memory of the ancestors alive. They were the spiritual thread that connected the people to the land, to the animals, and to the very forces of nature. And as we look to the future, we are reminded that these ancient stories, though they may fade with time, are still a part of the land itself, woven into its very soil, its rivers, and its stars. The fire has burned down to embers, and the cool night air whispers through the trees as we reach the edge of history. The first Europeans, those brave and curious sailors, are drawing closer, the great unknown stretching before them as they sail toward the southern tip of Africa. But before we go further into the world of the colonizers and the inevitable clash of cultures that would follow, let's pause and take a moment to imagine the scene from the perspective of the Khoisan and San people. They had lived in relative isolation for thousands of years, tuned to the rhythms of the land, the seasons, the animals. They were not unfamiliar with outsiders. Traders and travelers had come to their shores, but these new arrivals were something else entirely. Historians still argue about the precise moment when the first European ships anchored along the southern coast. Was it the Portuguese, seeking a route to the east, or the Dutch, hoping to find a safe harbor on their long journeys around Africa? Some believe it was the Portuguese in the late 15th century who made the first contact, while others suggest the Dutch had a hand in shaping the region's fate long before they established the Cape Colony in the 17th century. Regardless of who arrived first, the impact on the Khoisan and San peoples was inevitable. These new arrivals were not just curious travelers, they were agents of change, bringing with them not only their ships and weapons but also a worldview that was at odds with everything the Khoisan and San had known. The arrival of these European explorers was the beginning of the end of the Khoisan and San's way of life. For centuries they had lived in a world where their relationship with the land and the animals was the center of their existence. They had developed intricate social systems, spiritual practices, and survival techniques that allowed them to live in harmony with nature. But the Europeans brought with them new ideas about land ownership, about exploitation, about conquering the wilderness. They saw the land as something to be tamed, something to be controlled, and they brought with them technologies and weapons that the Khoisan and San could neither understand nor resist. It wasn't just the Europeans who would soon change the course of history, it was also the forces they brought with them. The introduction of new diseases, to which the Khoisan and San had no immunity, was devastating. Smallpox, measles, and other illnesses spread quickly, decimating entire communities. These diseases wiped out large portions of the population, leaving survivors weakened and vulnerable. The arrival of the Europeans didn't just bring new political and economic systems, it brought death, in the form of invisible pathogens that ravaged the indigenous peoples of southern Africa. But the changes didn't stop there. The Europeans came seeking wealth and land, and the Khoisan and San were caught in the middle of a global economic system they couldn't possibly have understood. The Portuguese and Dutch weren't just interested in the southern tip of Africa as a stopping point on their journeys. They saw the land as a potential source of resources. The Khoisan's cattle, their valuable shells, and their knowledge of the land all became commodities in this new world order. The people who had once lived in balance with their environment were now seen as obstacles to European expansion, and their way of life was increasingly under threat. The Khoisan and San fought back, but their resistance was scattered and ultimately doomed. Without the weapons, the political organization, or the support of larger states, they were unable to stand against the colonial forces. Their lands were taken, their resources plundered, and their cultures crushed under the weight of European imperialism. The first contact with the Europeans marked the beginning of centuries of conflict, displacement, and loss for the Khoisan and San peoples. But despite this, the spirit of the Khoisan and San did not completely fade. Their descendants, though scattered and marginalized, still carry the legacy of their ancestors. The stories, the traditions, and the wisdom that had been passed down through the generations are still alive in pockets of southern Africa today. The Khoisan and San peoples may have been forced to adapt to new ways of life, but their deep connection to the land, to the animals, and to each other continues to shape their identity. As we sit here, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the land, we are reminded that history is never a simple story of conquest and defeat. The Khoisan and San, with their rich cultures, their deep understanding of the land, and their enduring resilience, are not just relics of the past, they are the guardians of a way of life that has survived despite the odds. Their story is one of survival, adaptation, and the unbreakable bond between the people and the land they call home. The moon now casts a gentle, almost ethereal light over the land, and as we come to the final chapter of our journey, the pace slows. We've traveled through time, from the first people who walked this land to the moment when the world beyond their borders began to intrude. But before we close the book on this part of history, let's take one last look at what the Khoisan and San people stood for, what they were, and what they left behind. Their way of life wasn't simply a precursor to the arrival of outsiders. It was a profound, rich story of human connection to the earth, to each other, and to the unseen forces that shaped their world. Though the Khoisan and San cultures have faced centuries of marginalization, colonization, and destruction, their legacy remains embedded in the land, the language, and the people. The customs, beliefs, and survival techniques that once sustained their societies continue to ripple through the generations. The stories told around campfires, the songs sung under the stars, the rituals and practices that define their spiritual lives, all of these have left their mark on southern Africa, and their echoes can still be heard today, especially among those who continue to trace their heritage back to the first people. It's easy to think of these peoples as the past, as ancient relics of a simpler time. But to do so is to miss the point entirely. The Khoisan and San weren't just surviving, they were living in a way that we, in our modern world, have largely forgotten. Their survival was a testament to a profound understanding of the land and its cycles, a connection that many of us now lack in our technology-driven lives. They had learned to live not as masters of the land but as partners with it. This partnership, rooted in respect and balance, was the key to their resilience. The spiritual connection the Khoisan and San had with the land cannot be overstated. For them, the world was not divided into humans and nature, or the living and the dead. It was a continuum, a delicate web where every living thing had a role to play. Animals were not just prey, they were companions in the cycle of life. The land was not something to be owned, it was something to be respected, nurtured, and shared. This way of life was a reflection of a deeper wisdom, a wisdom that is increasingly rare in our modern world. As we sit under the same stars that once guided the Khoisan and San peoples, we realize that their story is far from over. The impact of their culture continues to reverberate through southern Africa, and their legacy is preserved in the land they once roamed, in the animals they revered, and in the communities they built. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, even in the wake of centuries of colonization, their spirit endures. So, as the embers of our fire die down, and the cool winds of the night begin to carry us back to the present, we find that the Khoisan and San peoples are not just characters from a history book, they are the ancestors of the land, the guardians of wisdom that stretches back thousands of years. Their story is one of survival, adaptation, and spiritual strength, a reminder of what it means to truly live in harmony with the earth. In the end, we are left with a sense of awe. The Khoisan and San may have lived long before us, but their legacy is timeless. They remind us that the relationship between humans and the natural world is sacred, that the stories of the past are still with us, and that the power to survive and thrive lies not in conquering the land but in understanding it. So, as we finish our journey through the calm before the Cape, let us carry with us the wisdom of the land and the people who first walked it, an enduring story of life, love, and survival at the edge of the world.